السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والعاقبة للمتقين، ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين، ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. Inshallah, we'll first briefly go through what we covered in last week's session. Before we go through that, the sessions are a bit heavy because there are so many things to cover, and sometimes it's difficult to choose what to put inside, what to not put inside, to what extent something needs to be discussed, to what depth. So it's a judgment on my behalf. Sometimes I might be right, sometimes I might be wrong, but it's a judgment that has to be made. If we were to go into the depth of everything that happened to try and understand everything fully, it would take a very long time. Like for example, last week we briefly went through the Balfour Declaration at the beginning. It could take a few sessions just to discuss the ins and outs and what happened before and after and everything related to the Balfour Declaration, which was a very significant point or turning point in the history of the blessed land of Al-Quds and the surrounding areas. And to prepare for each session, it takes a number of hours, or in fact it takes me the whole week, and then I have to put it all together, decide. So inshallah, we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal guides us and enables me to put forward to you those things which are most relevant and most important, in order for us to have a good understanding of all the events that took place. So again, today we'll be going through a number of events. Sometimes it might be a bit heavy, but inshallah we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal makes it easy for us to understand and comprehend. So briefly, just to go through last week, without going into any of the details, we discussed the Balfour Declaration and all of the key points that were relating to the declaration with regards to the specific semantics, the words that were used, etc. in the declaration, and what that meant for the rights of the population of Palestine, so the Muslims and even the Christians, and what it meant with regards to the rights of the Jews. Thereafter we discussed the escalation in 1929 with the Jews walking through the streets in Palestine, making their declarations, the response from the Muslims, and thereafter the few hundreds that were killed on both sides, and the quashing of the rebellion by the British forces at the time. Thereafter we discussed the immigration that took place by the British mandate, facilitated by the British, and also by the Jewish National Fund and the Jewish Congress, who was based in Palestine, where they were bringing people from Europe into Palestine. And obviously the numbers increased, as we saw, almost exponentially, up to 60,000 or more than 60,000 in the year 1936, which then led to one of the factors which led to the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 1939. And we discussed the incidents that took place during that period of time. And this led on to the precursor and eventually World War II, which we discussed, and we discussed the situation of Jews in Europe generally, and the accords and the discussions they had of where the Jews were being persecuted in Italy and Austria and Germany should go, and eventually only a few tens of thousands were taken by America and Argentina, and the rest of the countries said we are sympathetic, but Britain and France don't have space for any more. And thereafter the terror attacks which took place against the British also in Palestine in 1944. So this is what we discussed last week. Just a quick overview of the last points we mentioned with regards to the terror attacks. We had the British Minister of State assassinated, attempted assassination of the British High Commissioner, and then we had all of the events in 1945, 1946, 1947, which were taking place, attacks by the Irgun, by the Stern gang, etc., and all of these gangs that had been set up, paramilitaries at the time, from amongst the Zionist groups who are attacking British interests and also local Palestinians at the time up until the year 1947. And we discussed at the end the partition plan that was put forward at the United Nations in the UN for the partition of the land of Palestine. And we discussed that this was on the 29th of November, and there were 10 countries who abstained, but the rest 33 countries voted for the partition of the land of Palestine. And we said that 55% of the land was given to 37% of the population. So 55% of the land was given to 37% of the population, who were the Jews residing in the land of Palestine. And thereafter we showed the map, so not the first one but the second one, which was the partition plan of 1947, and the first map shows the actual inhabitants of the land in 1947. And as we can see, the population, so generally the population of the Jews in Palestine at that time were focused or were centered in urban centers. So they were mainly in cities and towns and villages. They weren't in the countryside, whereas the Palestinians were in the countryside. Therefore there's much larger land, as you can see in the first map, that's green as belonging to the Palestinians. And then we said we'll discuss the other maps later, inshallah. So now we need to understand the UN plan, the partition plan, a bit more, because this is the plan which is discussed. It's said to be the legal rights of each party, etc. So let's understand the UN partition plan a bit more. So the partition plan was agreed upon in 29th of November. There was a previous debate or a vote in the UN Security Council before the 29th of November, beginning of November, and in that vote there was not a 2/3 majority is needed, but the 2/3 majority was not reached. Thereafter, pressure took place, and if you go back and read the history books, you will find statements from, for example, the leader of, Truman, President Truman in America, and then other countries around the world where they were pressured. In fact, even India, who voted against the partition plan at the time, you will find the statements of the leaders of state that some of them were actually threatened with death if they did not vote in favor of the partition. And there are statements from other countries as well. In fact, one of the countries, their UN membership, after they voted against the partition plan, their representatives were banned from the United Nations. So, and this was the lobby, the Zionist lobby, in all of these countries, including in France, etc., that was pushing towards these states to vote in favor of the plan. So eventually the plan was agreed on the 29th of November, 1947. The plan outlined the following. It said that by 1st of August 1948, the British have to withdraw completely from the land of Palestine. So this is the first. Now remember, the year before, in 1947, Britain said we don't want to have anything more to do with the land of Palestine because it's getting too much for us. We can't reconcile between the Jews and the Palestinians or the Arabs. Thereafter, it said by the 1st of October, so 2 months later, so August and September, October, by the 1st of October, the two states have to be established. So these were the deadlines that were set in the 1947 partition plan. So what was the response by the different entities to this partition plan? So we have obviously the Zionist groups of the time. So we have the Jewish Agency, which was set up in Palestine. We have the World Zionist Organization. So generally they all accepted this plan. Generally they all accepted this plan. There were a few exceptions, really far right exceptions, who said no, we should not accept the full state of Israel, meaning all of the lands, all the way including Jordan, all the way up to the sea, which we already discussed previously of the right-wing groups. So apart from them, majority accepted the partition plan. But that doesn't mean that they all accepted, or the mainstream view was acceptance of this plan on a long-term basis. And we'll find out soon. So generally there was an acceptance from the official groups who represented the Zionist agenda, and so the two main groups in Palestine was the Jewish Agency, and then internationally was the World Zionist Organization. Now the reaction to this was similar to something which took place in 1937. So when the riots took place in 1936 to 1939, so there was a short pause in 1937 for the Peel Commission report. So they came, they assessed, the British government assessed what's taking place in Palestine, and then they came back and they produced the Peel report. And this was the first time that a partition was proposed. This was the first time the partition was proposed. That was back in 1937. And the partition that was proposed at that time was that the areas where the Jews are residing. So if we go back to this map, and if you look at the first map, we can see that the Jewish population, or the Jewish settlements, are mainly on the Mediterranean coast and the northern border of Lebanon. Yeah, we can see that on this map. So we have these areas here, these like light blue. So this area here all the way until this area here, which is Jordan. So, and the Lake Tiberias. So this area was designated in that plan as to be given to the Jews, and the rest of the area, so everything else from here, this green area, all the way here down to Gaza, all the way down to the bottom, was to be given to the Arabs. This was what the Peel report has suggested back in 1937. And obviously it was rejected by the Arabs then, and the Zionists at that time, the Jewish agency and the World ZO, they had a bit of a difference of opinion. Most of them, some of them agreed, some of them didn't, but eventually the plan came to nothing. But similar thing happened here. So we have the Jewish agency and the WZO, they agree to the UN partition plan. The Arabs, what did they say? They say that we rejected this plan. In the Peel plan, by the way, in 1937, they said that the land which belongs to the Jews, which they designated for the Jewish state, this would be only resided in by Jews. And the land which belongs to the Arabs will be only Arabs and no Jews. So in the Peel Commission, they recommended a transfer of Jews and Arabs. And when they recommended the transfer, what they said was that 225,000 Arabs have to move from where the Jewish state will be into the Arab state, and 1,250 Jews have to move from the Arab state to the Jewish state. So you can see there was absolutely no balance in terms of the numbers. So we come to the response of the Arabs to the UN partition plan. So majority of the Arabs, they rejected it. The local Palestinians, they outright rejected this plan. The other Arab states at that time, so we have Egypt, who's the southern border, we have Jordan, we have Syria. At that time it wasn't called Jordan, it was called Transjordan, and we mentioned this before, it was called Transjordan. So they all rejected the UN partition plan. They didn't agree to it. There was, however, not a consensus. There wasn't a consensus. So we had individuals, so for example we have Al-Nashashibi. Al-Nashashibi was from one of the two main groups in Palestine, or the elites in Palestine. So as we said, Britain used to support the elites in Palestine even during the British mandate. So from the two families, and they used to play them off each other, the divide and rule. So we have the Al-Husayni family, and we have the Al-Nashashibi family. And so what the British did was they played them off each other. Al-Nashashibi family was more political, more rich, more wealthy, and so they were seen as the rich elites. And the Al-Husayni family, they were more seen as the religious elites. And from them they selected, the British appointed the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And we'll come to him soon. So when the partition plan was put forward, the Nashashibis actually, they said, no, let's go with it, so that at least we get our state. And these two groups were, at the time, their salaries were being paid by the British during the British mandate, even before up to 1947. They generally opposed the the common masses and try to control the masses with regards to their uprisings or their opposition in any other way other than a political or discussions with the British or with the League of Nations, and then later on the UN. So their arguments were always that no, we should just have discussions, and through negotiations we'll be able to create the state for the Arabs. But it never came to being. The local people revolted, and neither of the two sides achieved their goal. Anyway, so there were some exceptions. Okay, before we go into, have a look at the map. So these are the boundaries that were defined in 1947. So if we look at the blue area, this was the area that was assigned for the Jewish state in the partition plan of 1947. Then we have the pink and green areas. The pink and green areas. These areas are assigned to the Arabs, by the UN. And then you have the light blue areas. So that's this small area here, small areas here near Syria, on the border of Syria and Jordan. And these areas were, and the pink area, the deep pink area, these areas were supposed to be under international rule, international administration. So it would be that the Jerusalem would neither be ruled by the Arabs nor by the Jews. It should be open for everyone. It should be open for everyone because it's a holy place for all Jews, Christians and Muslims. Therefore everyone should have access to this place and no one group should rule Jerusalem. This was the proposal of the UN partition plan. And in the Peel Commission they did a similar thing. What they did was all the way from Tel Aviv, which is here on the coast, all the way to Jerusalem, they put like a section here like this, like a triangle, and said that this area will be under international control, so that there's a path to go to Jerusalem and back, and it's not controlled by Muslims or Christians or Jews. Anyway, so this was the proposal in 1947. And this map is a good map because from this map we can then see what happens a couple of years later in 1949. The green line, the armistice demarcation lines, and this was after the war that took place, after the 1948 war that took place, the Arab-Israeli conflict as it's known as. And what happened then is, if you can see the blue area which was for the Jewish state, the pink area which was supposed to be Arab state, the light blue area which was supposed to be under international rule or UN administration, they all became part of Israeli controlled territory. And then the pink areas and the green areas, they became under the Arab control. So Egyptian control was in the area of Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and Jordanian control was in the West Bank. And this was from 1948 until 1967. But we'll go into those details later. But this is a good map for reference for anyone who wants to know the comparison of the partition plan, what took place after the war in 1949, and thereafter until the modern day is very similar to this map. Anyway, so what happens after the UN partition plan in the aftermath? So first of all, you have Arab political action. So what the Arab states and all of the Arab League, etc., what they did was they rejected the UN partition plan, and they rejected it based on a legal basis. So first of all, they said that the League of Nations had already given rights to the Palestinians and all of the other countries to establish their own state, and the UN can't come and abolish the League of Nations in this way. So they decided that they want to go to the international court and take the UN agreement to the international court and basically have the international court decide whether the UN partition plan is legal or not. This was their plan, and so they took a legal route, and this is what they decided to do in terms of the political response to the partition plan. So they claimed that the UN does not have the authority, and it also goes against the UN's own charter. So this partition plan. So these were the two legal points that were raised by the Arab League, etc. Now, the British, after the partition plan, and this is very important, that the British in the plan, we saw that 10 countries abstained, right? From the 10 countries that abstained, one of the countries that did not vote for or against the partition plan was Britain. They did not vote for the partition plan in 1947. As you can see, before that, they proposed partition, they gave the Balfour Agreement, declaration, all of these things. But when it came to the partition plan in 1947, the British said, we're not having anything to do with it, and they did not vote for or against, they just abstained. So, because they had been there for 30 years, they knew the situation on the ground, and therefore they did not want to get their hands dirty. And so they said, we cannot vote this way or that way. So they stayed aloof. They had nothing to do with the partition plan. And this had an impact on what they did in terms of their actions. So unilaterally, we have the cabinet, the British cabinet, in December, they come together, they decide, okay, what shall we do now that the partition plan has been made, even though we don't think it's a good idea. If you look at the papers, they said, we don't think it's a good idea, but what shall we do? So they decided that they will end the British mandate in Palestine on the 14th of May 1948. So this was agreed by the cabinet in December 1947. And they said that we will withdraw completely from Jerusalem and eventually the whole of Palestine before the date that has been set by the UN of 1st of August. So they made this decision as the cabinet. When the 14th of May 1948 came and the British mandate ended, they did not, because they abstained from the vote, they didn't even collaborate with the UN, let alone the Palestinian forces or the Jewish agency, whatever, to hand over power in these places. No. What they did was they just packed their bags and left the door. That's it. They left a vacuum. They did not leave anything in place. They didn't hand over power to the UN or to the Jews or to the Arabs. They just packed the bags and left. So they left a vacuum in Jerusalem and everywhere else. On the 15th of May 1948, so as soon as the British packed their bags, the Jewish Congress, the World Zionist Organization, etc., they all announce the State of Israel. They declare the creation or the establishment of the State of Israel. It is Israel on the 15th of May 1948, and this was in Tel Aviv. And currently the place is still exists in Tel Aviv, and it's called. They have a hall there, and it's a place of celebration. And that night, all of the members of all of these various groups in Israel, they gave out free champagne, free wine, and it was a day of celebration, the 15th of May 1948. Now, what happened immediately after the partition plan and just before as well, this obviously created unrest. There was already unrest for years because of what's been happening, the land taking, the rules that the Arabs can't work on Jewish land, etc. All of these things, prices have been pushed up because they're paying double, triple the price of the cost of the land. So people have been, and we already mentioned the attacks that had been going on by the right-wing groups. So now the unrest increases. And there are attacks on both sides. The Arabs attack the paramilitary groups of the Zionists. The Zionists go and attack Palestinian and Arab villages, and this all happens in the aftermath of the UN partition plan being made public. Thereafter, we have the Middle East, and as we said before, although they generally rejected the UN partition plan, but these states were not very strong. Number one, they weren't very powerful. They had just been established after World War I, so they weren't long-term states. They were basically established out of defeat of the Ottoman Empire, so their foundations were weak, and also they weren't united. They had differences amongst themselves. And you had the Arab League, and we still have the Arab League. You had the Arab League, but then you had Transjordan, and they were not all in agreement with regards of what to do with regards in terms of Palestine and the people of Palestine, and they had their own agendas, etc. And if you remember, at that time there was a lot of nationalist movement. There was a nationalist movement, and they had wanted cessation from the Uthmani Khilafah and the Ottoman Empire, and this was in the aftermath of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So the heads of these states were those who had been there, or who were put there, or who had come to power after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So let's look at some key figures of the time who are very important, or who played a significant role in history at the time. So we have number one, David Ben Gurion. David Ben Gurion.
Can I ask a question here? Sorry to stop you in between. Now, if we say 15th of May 1948, it was declared the State of Israel. What did stop the Palestinian to declare the State of Palestine at that time, or for that matter, Arab at that time?
Okay, so we'll come to that. We'll come to that. So we have David Ben Gurion, and David Ben Gurion was the leader of the World Zionist Organization, and he was also a member. Eventually, he became sort of the director of the Haganah Zionist paramilitary group, which we mentioned before. They were like the defense forces, and eventually they formed the IDF of the Jewish settlements and villages and towns. And then in response to the skirmishes and things that were going on between the Palestinians and or the Arabs and the Jews, he in 1947 in December he did conscription for every adult man and woman Jew, male and female Jew in Palestine. So they all had to do military service, and that exists in Israel until today. Every man and woman has to do military service. And eventually he became the first Prime Minister of Israel. Eventually he became the first Prime Minister of Israel. And there are many statements of his, and he was the leading figure. So if you remember, we discussed Weizmann. He was a chemical engineer who was working with the British government and the leader of the Zionist organization. When the British seemed to be playing a double game, even to the Zionists, Weizmann stepped down. Eventually Ben Gurion becomes the leader of the Zionist movement. And what he said was, he has a famous statement, he said that we will join the war as if there's no white paper. Remember the white paper that said that my immigration, etc., has to be limited of the Jews and the rights to the Palestinians, etc. So he said, we will fight in the world war as if there's no white paper, and we'll fight the white paper as if there's no world war. And thereafter he said, when the UN partition plan was put forward, he said, we will agree to the partition plan. And there's letters that he has written to his son, and you can find many other documents which he made, his statements which he made and documents which he wrote, where he said that we will agree to the partition plan because this is the start of the establishment of the greatest state of Israel. So his aim was not just the borders that were made by the UN. His aim was to establish the complete state of Israel, all the way from the sea, all the way to the river. And this was his goal, this was his plan, which he had said before. And this was generally the majority opinion of the Zionist group, the WZO, and the Jewish Congress in Palestine. They wanted the whole land, not just part of the land. And this was almost, you could say, a consensus view amongst them. Only the right wing rejected, and they said, no, we want everything from the start. So this was David Ben Gurion. He eventually went on to become the first Prime Minister of Israel. Then you have King Abdullah I bin Hussein, and he was the king of Jordan. He was the king of Jordan, or Transjordan. Initially he was Transjordan, and then he eventually became Jordan. So if you remember, we talked about Hussein, King Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, the one who had allied with the British in Hijaz to fight against the Ottomans, and then establish an Arab state in Hijaz, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. So Abdullah is his son. Abdullah is his son. So Abdullah was obviously with his father when they had the secret meetings with the British, where they made an agreement to fight against the Ottoman Empire. So Jordan was under British mandate, remember, British influence. So even though his father eventually turned against the British, and they got rid of his father by supporting Saud to come from Najd and take over Hijaz, but they put his son, King Abdullah, in Transjordan. So King Abdullah becomes the king of Transjordan. And so he's allied with the British. He was sponsored by the British at the time, and he had a different view. What he saw was that no, in fact he came to an opinion that let's accept the UN mandate. Let's accept the UN mandate, and what we do is we join the Arab areas of Palestine, with Transjordan to become one whole Arab state. So basically, he wanted to rule over all of the areas of Palestine, and we will see that he did eventually take over the West Bank and rule the West Bank for a period of time. And this was his view. So he said, okay, let's accept the UN plan. Let's take over the West Bank and all the Arab areas as determined by the UN plan, and it can all form one state with Transjordan. So this was King Abdullah the first. And then you have the Mufti Amin al-Husayni, or Muhammad Amin al-Husayni. Muhammad Amin al-Husayni was appointed by the British as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem during the British mandate. And he was paid a stipend by the British mandate because they were the government. He was paid a stipend. So the title before, under the Ottomans and under the Uthmani Khilafah, was not the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. This title was made by the British during the British mandate, and he was made the Mufti, and this was the title given to him in Jerusalem. And as I said, the two families, and he's the other family, Al-Husayni family. And so from 1921, when he was appointed, all the way into 1936, when the revolt started, he was basically allied completely with the British, and he would try to subdue anyone who wanted to rise up against the British, etc. And this is what happened until 1936. However, in 1936, once things began to go out of hand and all the people turned against the British and revolt started, he also turned against the British. He joined the revolt and the revolution. But then eventually he had to escape from Palestine. The British wanted him because he was appointed by them as a Grand Mufti, and then he turned against them. So he ran away to Lebanon, then he ran away to Iraq, then eventually from there he ran all the way to Nazi Germany just before the Second World War, and during the Second World War in Nazi Germany and Italy. And he had discussions with Hitler and with all the senior leadership of the Nazis in Germany. And there's a lot of pamphlets that he produced whilst he was in Germany. He used to do radio broadcasts for the people of Palestine all the way from Germany at that time, and he tried to gather support for the Palestinians from Germany, etc. Anyway, without going into much detail, but he played a significant role in the events that took place at the time, and also thereafter the accusations of anti-Semitism, etc. A lot of these are linked to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Muhammad Amin al-Husayni. After the Second World War, he then goes to, he's given refuge by the French, and goes to Cairo. He seeks refuge in Cairo. And then eventually, when, in answer to your question, when as a response to the UN partition plan, first it was rejected. The reason why they did not declare a state was because they wanted all of Palestine, and they did not want to agree to the state of, so they just wanted British mandate to end and the Palestinians to rule the same land. They did not see the need to establish a new state. They thought that the British would go and we just rule. When on the 15th of May, when the state of Israel was established, they then went on to announce the All-Palestine government. So the Arab League announced a government. Anyway, so All-Palestine government was established, but it was mainly established just in Gaza under the protection or patronage of Egypt. And at that time, they appointed Muhammad Amin al-Husayni as the president of Palestine, or the All-Palestine government. And again, the All-Palestine government did not rule everything because King Abdullah of Jordan had taken over the West Bank. and also the locals were not really in agreement with Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, and he had quite a nationalistic viewpoint, and eventually he was removed from his post. The old Palestine government comes to an end, and he eventually moves to Lebanon and then passes away in the 1970s. King Abdullah, by the way, the first, after he took over the West Bank, the Palestinian nationalists who did not want to be ruled by Jordan, they assassinated him at the doors of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So King Abdullah was killed and assassinated at the doors of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, or those doors of Jerusalem, a few years later. So these are the individuals who played a key role in the events that took place at the time. And then we have the war that starts in 1948. Now, there's a background to the war. You need to understand what's happening here, because what the general statements, if you look from the Zionist agencies, is that at the time, and even consequently much later on, what they said was that we fought against much greater odds and we defeated them. We were only 600,000, they were 1.2 million, and we defeated a force double our size. Now, what were the actual realities on the ground at that time in Palestine? So the first thing is, in the 1936 to 1939 revolt, there was a British crackdown on the Arabs. And in that time, 10% of the adult male Arab population, so the adult male Arab Muslim population in Palestine was killed. 5,000 people were killed between 1936 and 1939. So 10%. And then we have 10,000 who were imprisoned. So 10,000 were imprisoned. And if you compare that to the number of Jews who were killed during that 3-year period, it was only 400. And the number of British soldiers who were killed was 200. So you can see the massive disparity in the numbers. At the same time, the British confiscated the weapons of all of those people who were taking part in these riots and these skirmishes. So from the Palestinians and the Arabs, the British confiscated 13,200 weapons. 13,200 weapons. And from the Jews, they confiscated 521 weapons. So again, you can see the disparity in numbers in every single fact. And what they also did was, during that time, they set up the Jewish police. The British trained and set up the Jewish police, made up of Jewish police force, 6,000 members. They also set up a few thousand members who were the night squads. And these were joined by the Zionist military groups, who then used to go and terrorize the Palestinians at night. So these were night squads. They were specifically set up to go to people's homes and raid homes at night. All together during this period, separate from World War I. If you remember World War I, we set up to 40,000 Jews enlisted in the British Army. So this is separate from that. 20,000 Jews in this period were recruited and trained by the British in Palestine. This is separate from the World War I. And in all, approximately 8 to 10% of the Jewish population in Palestine were trained militarily by the British and armed by the British. So this is just a background in terms of the military might of the two sides. And then we have the leadership split, as we said. So there were many different leaders amongst the Arabs. We mentioned King Abdullah of Jordan, we mentioned the Mufti Amin al-Husseini, we mentioned the other families, and then there was also a lot of different individual groups, smaller groups in Palestine, and then we had obviously the Arab League and etc. All of these. So the Arabs were not united, whereas the Jewish had one Jewish Congress, the Zionists had one Jewish Congress, they had one World Zionist Organization, and even though when they opened first the Jewish agency in Palestine, they accepted non-Zionists into this movement, and they were, even though they weren't, but the Zionists still remained a majority. They were more than 50%. Eventually, all of the non-Zionists were pushed out from the main seats until they all left. At the end, basically there was no difference between the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization. In effect, they were both the same thing. So they basically had one voice, whereas the Muslims and the Palestinians or the Arabs, they didn't have one voice. There were many different voices, and they weren't all on the same page. Then we had we've got actually an account of the military that the Zionists had at that specific point in time. So they had 16,000 light weapons. They had 1,000 machine guns. They had 750 light mortars. So they were not just a people who were living there and looking after their lands and living in their homes. They were basically a military force. And they had fortified their towns. So they had dug trenches. They were ready for war. They had dug trenches. They had built bunkers, bomb shelters, barbed wire fences around the villages to protect themselves. They had planted minefields in the fields around their villages as booby traps for anyone who's to come and attack them. And they had done this in 300 towns in which they were residing. So they had prepared and equipped themselves for war. And in the consequence of this, later on we have in April 1948, so even before the British Mandate ends in May, we have the Deir Yassin massacre. And this is a very famous massacre that took place, and you will probably have heard about it. And so what happens in the Deir Yassin massacre is that the leaders of the town, they say to the groups, the Irgun group, that there are some foreigners, meaning strange individuals who are not part of Deir Yassin, who have come here. We'll hand them over to you, or we'll let you know where they've gone if we have any information. We'll hand them over to you, give you the information, and you leave the village alone. Basically, this was the agreement. But instead, what they did was they completely surrounded the village. And on Jumu'ah, on Friday, on the 9th of April, they entered into Deir Yassin. They entered into Deir Yassin, and they massacred the people in Deir Yassin. The massacre was horrendous. If you look at the casualties, 250 people. It's a small village. 250 people were killed, and not just were they killed. They killed pregnant women alive. They would get the bayonets and stabbed 25 pregnant women in their wombs while the women were still alive. They took babies out of the mother's wombs and decapitated them. They killed children. So 52 children were killed, beheaded in front of their mothers, and then the mothers were then decapitated. Women were raped. The massacre of Deir Yassin was absolutely horrendous, and this became obviously the news of the massacre spread throughout the whole of the land of Palestine and into all the Arab states surrounding Palestine. The news went to Jordan, it went to Egypt, it went to Syria, it went to all of these countries. And obviously, as always happens, exaggerations take place, etc. So things were changed in terms of the numbers. What happens, the events are always exaggerated a bit more than what actually took place. But what took place in and of itself was horrendous anyway. So this was regarded as one of the first most horrendous massacres that took place in the land of Palestine, to the extent that the village of Deir Yassin ceased to exist. The village of Deir Yassin ceased to exist. Now there is a Jewish settlement in Deir Yassin. There is no sign of the people who lived in Deir Yassin remaining. There are roads and playgrounds and everything are set up for the Jewish town which was then established under a different name in the same area. So Deir Yassin was basically completely wiped off the map. And this was, you could say, the main massacre, or the major massacre that took place even before the British left Palestine. Now at that time there were UN forces, there was the British forces, but they just turned a blind eye and they did not get involved at all in this massacre. And this was not the only one. The terror attacks and the attacks by these militias and the Zionist groups continued. So for example, from before that, Deir Yassin, and even after. So we have in December 1947, they go inside Yahideh village. They go inside Khisas, which is Qazaza village, and they attacked everyone. They go past a cafe, they throw a bomb into bomb into a cafe. They'll be driving by, they'll just open fire on civilians just sitting in the street. For example, they bombed a house of one of the leaders of the local leaders, tribal leaders of the local Palestinian Muslims, and they killed the whole family, including 5 children. He was there with 5 children and his wife. They killed the whole family. In January 1948, 200 Zionists, they surrounded the town of Al-Sheikh at night. At night, they surrounded the town and they went inside in the middle of the night while the people were sleeping, and they massacred 40 people, majority of them women and children. We have in April 1948 the Lehi and the Irgun gang. The Lehi is basically known as the Stern gang. They went to Nasr ad-Din village. They lined the people up. They killed all of them. Only 40 people survived from that village. Only 40 people survived from Nasr ad-Din village. In May 1948, the Beit Daras village was surrounded, encircled. It was laid to siege. Eventually the man said, okay, the women and children, let them go out and we'll stay. You can attack us or whatever, we'll fight. We're going to stay in our home. Let the women and children go free if you want to take over this village. So they said, okay. They said they opened a humanitarian route or humanitarian corridor to let the women and children leave the village. As the women and children are leaving, they opened fire and killed them. Many of them were injured and many of them were killed. We then have July 1948 in Damash Masjid. They are there while they are rounding up Palestinians, Muslims. One of the Palestinians, he snuggles a grenade and he throws a grenade towards the Israeli militia, killing about 7 or 8. In retaliation, they open fire and kill up to 100 people, between 80 and 100 people inside the masjid. And in consequence of that, they then spread out in the surrounding areas and they forced 60,000 people from Lidda and Ramle to migrate and move out of their homes. So this is a mass expulsion of people from their homes. And all of these incidents are continuing. In October 1948, again in Dawima village, 80 to 100 people are killed. And the stories, in fact, those who carried out these atrocities, they gave statements to the media then and even decades later of what they did, to the extent that some of them, and you may even have seen videos of them laughing, of them smiling and being proud of what they carried, of what they did. They said that when some of their own statements, when we were killing children, this is how we used to kill children. We'll get sticks and we'll fracture their skulls until they die. Their own witness statements with regards to their own actions. With regards to, for example, Deir Yassin, we have the famous member of Irgun who took part in the massacre of Deir Yassin, and he later on becomes a prime minister of Israel, and he was a registered or designated terrorist by the British, but he then became the prime minister of Israel and he took part in the massacre of Deir Yassin. Menachem Begin. And what he said was, after the massacre, he said, what was done at Deir Yassin, without what was done at Deir Yassin, there would not be the state of Israel. And he said that while the defense front, the IDF, the Haganah as we mentioned, the precursor to the IDF, was carrying out successful attacks on all the other fronts, the Arabs were still crying Deir Yassin, Deir Yassin, Deir Yassin, and out of fear they were running away because of what happened in Deir Yassin. And this, he later became the prime minister of Israel. And Deir Yassin, actually, there's a Holocaust memorial museum in Israel. And the area of where Deir Yassin once stood can be seen from the Holocaust memorial. It can be seen from the museum. The area where all of these Muslims were and these Palestinians were massacred. And the streets inside the settlement, which exists now in the place of where Deir Yassin used to exist, Givat Shaul Bet is the name of the settlement. The streets are named after the fighters of the Irgun gang who carried out the massacre in Deir Yassin until today. And all the masajid and the homes were all bulldozed. Now, these actions that were being carried out by these militia, these were not actions that they had come up with. And even until today, for example, we see that probably one of the only armies in the world that has as a regular machinery of war, alongside tanks and armored personnel carriers and etc., they have bulldozers. Which other country in the world has bulldozers as part of their military or a significant part of their military arsenal? Hardly anyone else. But this was taking place then. They were bulldozing homes. But this started with the British. So in the uprising from 1936 to 1939, when the British were raiding the homes of the Palestinians who were involved in the revolt against the British mandate, the British were very harsh. They were arresting the whole family. They were beating people. They were, as we said, so 5,000 were killed. And what they would do is that the homes of those who were revolting against the British, they would come with bulldozers and raze those homes to the ground. They would raze those homes to the ground. And this policy has been carrying on from 1936 until today. It's the same policy which was enacted by the British against the uprising from 1936 to 1939. And as we just mentioned, that from there they had got almost 20,000 from the Jewish members of society who were living at the time to be part of the British police force. And they were also carrying this out on behalf of the British at the time. So these are all of the massacres that took place. And obviously in retaliation of these massacres, there were also attacks by the Arabs on the Jews. So for example, at one point they cut off the road. There was a mass movement, 100,000 Palestinian Arabs. They blocked off the roads to not allow the movement of the Haganah to go anywhere. So they cannot bring their supplies, they cannot bring their troops, etc. to go and attack other villages. They completely blocked off the road. So the leader of the Haganah at the time, he says, okay, let's send more military vehicles, armored personnel carriers, see if we can send more people. But the more people who were being sent to these areas, they were being stopped, they were being killed, and they weren't able to break through the 100,000 Palestinian Arabs who had blocked these roads. So what they then did instead was go to all of these small villages that were on the fringe and attack the Muslims and the Palestinian Arabs in those areas where the 100,000 were not blocking off the roads and allowing them to the main areas and main cities towards Jerusalem, etc. They also, for example, there were also attacks by Arabs on buses that were carrying Jews. So eventually what happens is that over the years, pre-1900, we have the Jews, the Christians and the Muslims living together peacefully. You have them living together peacefully. And then before the Balfour Declaration and then after the Balfour Declaration, through the Zionist movement and the declaration of creating a Jewish state or a home for the Jewish people or a homeland in the land of Palestine, this creates friction between the Jews and the Arabs. And there were already Jews who were residing in Palestine from before. They were called the Arabian Jews. And then there were the Jews who came from Europe. The Arabs generally, initially, they had a problem with the Jews who came from Europe. And even if you look at the statements and the declarations of the Arab League and King Abdullah and all of these individuals who we have mentioned and who we will continue to mention, their statements were very simple. They said that all of the European Jews or the Zionists cannot remain in Palestine. This is what they said. They said the Zionists and the European Jews cannot remain in Palestine. But the Arab Jews who were remaining there from before, they have the full right to remain, and they will have full autonomy in terms of their own affairs in and amongst themselves, as they have had for over 1,000 years in this land. But the rule will be for the Arabs. The rule will be for the Arabs and the Palestinians and the local indigenous population. However, obviously, due to all of these things, it created a greater friction between the Jews and the Arabs. And that's why in a lot of the statements, etc., you will find the statements of, or sometimes blanket statements, the Jews, etc. This was because of, and the Jews of the time saying the Arabs. This was because the conflict was created between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, following on from all of these incidents that took place until 1948. And obviously this friction continued until today. We'll stop here because from here we need to enter into the war that took place between all of the countries. So when Syria, Jordan, Egypt, they then enter into Palestine and they wage war against Israel in Palestine, and the consequences of the war and what took place. Inshallah, we'll cover this. We'll start from this next week, inshallah ta'ala. Before we finish, if there are any questions with regards to what we discussed today. No? No questions? No.
You know, Mufti Amin, because a lot of the Zionist propaganda nowadays talk about Mufti Amin and how he was a Nazi sympathizer,
yes,
and anti-Semitism, etc. But he wasn't really representative of the people, was he? He was like a British puppet, in effect.
Yeah, so the question is with regards to Mufti Amin, and Mufti Amin is portrayed by a lot of the Zionist media until today that he was the leader of Palestine, the president of the All Palestine Parliament, and he had links with the Nazis, etc., and he was representative of the Palestinian people. So as we discussed, initially he was appointed by the British. He was appointed by the British from 1921 to 1936. He was completely allied with the British. He wasn't chosen by the local people. In fact, most of the locals were not in support of him. He was actually appointed when he was very young, and he was appointed by the British to play him off against his cousin, who had another group and another movement at that time. So they played him and his cousin, and they basically stayed as enemies during the whole period. So he wasn't a representative in the sense of the local people. He was appointed by the British. He was in his post as the Grand Mufti by the British. The people weren't all in agreement with the Grand Mufti. There were scholars who came around separate from their senior scholars to him who did not agree with him. And they had different rulings. They were followed by more people. And so when he turned against the British, he was not from those who instigated the rebellion. He was not from the majority who rebelled against the British. He turned against the British because of the majority. Yeah? So you could say he just rode the seas. He went with the flow as what was happening. Everyone's standing there. He can't lose all of his people, so he just has to jump on the boat and the bandwagon with them. So that was why he turned against the British, because he saw that basically I'm going to lose my post. I'm the Grand Mufti and I don't support my people. And the people were already not really in support of him anyway. He obviously he did have an impact on the local people because he was in Germany, and in Germany he was able to speak openly against what was taking place in Palestine. Obviously he had extreme rhetoric, but the local people they weren't able to speak in the same way that he was able to, and obviously they were weak. Nazi Germany had a very strong force, and so they had radio stations, and they were broadcasting his lectures, etc., to all the people in Palestine. So they had set up the radio station to be broadcasted in Palestine to propagate their propaganda, etc. So and he didn't come into Palestine. He went to Cairo. That's where he was. We're going to cover it, but he was declared the president of the All Palestinian Parliament. He entered into Gaza for a short period of time, and then eventually the All Palestinian Parliament, which was not representative of the Palestinian people, was eventually just in Cairo. They were a government in exile, not ruled by the people. Eventually the people turned against him and set up their own separate organizations, as we will find out. So no, he was not a representative of the general public of the Arab Palestinians. So it's a wrong statement or claim that he represents the view of all of the people in Palestine, that they just want to kill all the Jews or have enmity against all Jews to eradicate all of them. That's not true. Sorry, I think you had another question.
Just explain more about the Arab Jews who are there, and what about the Jews in North Africa? Are they same people?
Okay, so the question is with regards to the Arab Jews and the North African Jews. The North African Jews, will leave them for now because they're not really relevant up until this point to this area, otherwise we'll be going a bit too far. They do become a bit relevant later because Israel did send planes, etc., to bring Jews from Ethiopia, etc., to Israel. But the Jews that were living in Palestine, so as we said, under Muslim rule, the Jews were able to live in Palestine in total peace, and they have been living for a long time. Obviously, at the time of the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa by Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, and Abu Ubaid ibn al-Jarrah and Khalid ibn al-Walid radiallahu anhum, there were no Jews living there because the Christians were in charge and they absolutely hated the Jews. So they had removed them, completely kicked them out of Jerusalem. After the conquest of and the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa, 70 families moved back, and thereafter they multiplied, obviously, over generations. So there were a number of Jews who were already residing there. A few thousand were there, and they continued to reside in Jerusalem. Obviously, there were periods of the Crusades where they were expelled, etc. But then they came back once the Muslims came back, and they remained there until obviously the influx of the Jews from Europe. The local Arabs were still there. So they are descendants for thousands of years or hundreds of years. They have remained in the land of Palestine. So these are the Al-Yahud al-Mu'arraba, the Arabian Jews. That's what they were known as in Arabic. And so they had been there for a long time, and they had absolutely no conflict with the local people. There was no conflict until the Zionist movement came and entered into the land of Palestine, and this created the conflict. And obviously, once a conflict starts, lines get blurred. So the people will not differentiate whether this is an Arab Jew or a European Jew. Maybe they might be on the same bus, or they're living together in the same village. So eventually they all become targets, and then people align with this side or that side. So eventually that's what happens. But again, until today, there are still Jews who live in the land of Palestine, in the occupied territories, etc., who are not in favor of the state of Israel. They are not in favor of the state of Israel. And you might have seen a few weeks ago, for example, videos of those Arabs who are protecting, Arabian Jews protecting Palestinians and their rights, and they are being abused by the Israeli military and the Israeli army in Jerusalem itself. They're being thrown onto the floor, attacked, etc. And these are the Orthodox Jews. And this relates to what happened with regards to Zionism. As we said, it wasn't a small group, but the individuals who were part of this group were politically active. They were very wealthy, and so they had a lot of sway. And eventually, due to what happens with the Balfour Declaration, etc., and the establishment of a state and the actual state coming to being, this just basically increased the support that they had from around the world. And therefore their numbers increased very quickly, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, from a few thousand to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands just in America alone, for example. So so a lot of the Jews then joined the Zionist movement. But initially they were a small group, it wasn't a large group. And until today you still have the Orthodox Jews, etc., who oppose the establishment of a state or a homeland for Jews in the blessed lands, and believe that it goes against the rules and the commands that have been given to the Jewish people in the Old Testament, and they believe it is a sin for such a state to be established, and that is their view until today. And we see them in the protests, in the marches, the sit-ins that they did in New York, and until today their continuous campaigning. Any other questions?
Were the Christians not interested in the land of Palestine as well?
The Christians?
Yeah.
So the local Christians or the European Christians?
As in, generally the European
So the European Christians by that time were not interested in the land of Palestine. The reason was that once the French Revolution took place, which we mentioned, eventually it became a secular society in Europe, not a religious society. So therefore they did not have a religious devotion to taking over the land of Palestine. There was still an element which we mentioned. So for example, when the British commander took over and entered Jerusalem at the end of World War I, he said, now the Crusades have ended. And then we have evangelical Christians who until today believe that they need to bring all the Jews into Palestine so that they can cause the Messiah to come and Isa alayhi salam to return. So there are these Jews, these Christians still exist until today, and we discussed them last week. But generally, as the Christendom, the whole faith, they didn't have the European Christians. They didn't have any interest in the land of Palestine. Obviously, local Arab Christians, they were allied with the Muslims in terms of defense of the land. They were against the Zionist Jews, and they are until today because they were oppressed as well, and they rejected the UN partition plan. They rejected the Balfour Declaration, and they have statements and etc. that they've made from that time as well against all of these statements and plans that were put into place. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm going to ask, so what year was the actual Israeli state formed where Palestinians had the West Bank and Gaza? When did that happen?
Yeah, so this happens in the consequence of the 1948 war, which we'll discuss next week. So even though they declared the state of Israel, but it was just in Tel Aviv, inside what was then a museum. They just declared the state of Israel. Now they had set up parallel apparatus to the British government. They had set up parallel apparatus to the British government. So they had, as we mentioned, we had all the paramilitary groups, but alongside the paramilitary groups, they also had civil services. So they had the Jewish National Fund, which was like the treasury. So they had a financial group. They also had an administrative group. They had hospitals. They had all of this civil infrastructure from before. They had an agricultural department which had been because obviously they were trying to take the land from before. That was their plan. And so in order to put their plan into place, they had to put all of these structures into place. That will take over land, will purchase land, will then cultivate the land, will irrigate the land. And so this is basically a Department of Agriculture. They had a department of all the roads that they were making in between villages which they had just made in the desert, so or in the wilderness that where nothing existed before. They made villages, and they took advantage of. For example, there was a rule by the Ottoman Empire that once you build a building with a roof, it cannot just be demolished just like that. You have to take it to court, and there has to be a whole discussion before it can be demolished. Anyway, it refers back to certain points of fiqh in Islamic law as well. But the rule was that if somebody purchases land, even though he may need to get permission to build on that land, but if he was to build a structure with a roof, it cannot be just demolished. It has to go through a court process. And so what they did was they built loads of structures. They set up villages, they set up towns where there had only been land and cultivation and orchards before, or lands that were not even used at all. So yeah, that's basically how they went into all of these different areas.
Why is he saying that? Why is that going on? What were the Muslims doing at that time, in the sense that how did they get so powerful to have tanks? Is it like the British just left and they took control of those tanks? Or if the British were funding them? No, so at this point where we've reached right now, they had the armored vehicles because the British gave it to them. If you remember, they set up the police force, they joined the British Army in the First World War. Whereas the Arabs supported the British, they only had like maybe about 5,000 or 6,000 Arabs who actually physically joined the British Army, and even that was mainly in like Egypt, etc. Whereas the Jews, they went and they actually fought for the British and joined the British, and they had up to 35,000, including special forces. And so they were given weapons by the British, and then when they made the police force, they were given weapons by the British as well. So the local population didn't really gain much. And the British were not in favor of the local population having arms because
they had revolted against the British from 1936 to 1939, and they were not happy because the British had forced their rule on them for 30 years. Is that obviously that's different to the other countries, but we're talking about the local Palestinians.
Other countries surrounding to dispute this
Yeah, so as we said, they were initially the surrounding countries like Jordan and all of these. They were propped up by the British after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So King Abdullah was a British ally, all of these. So they didn't really have a problem with the British in that sense because they were paid by the British. Yeah.
I just want to ask how Israel gets support from Britain. So Palestine getting support from other weapons.
So the state of Israel wasn't established yet. So we have the Zionist group getting funded from Britain, but we also have the Jewish National Fund. Remember that's also playing a big role. It's not just that. And we have British facilitation of ships. There were times when in 1939 for a couple of years, when the British had stopped the movement of ships and migration of Jews to Palestine. The Jewish National Fund and other funds was actually taking in 1 year, for example, over 100 ships and trying to bring the Jews from Europe and from Germany, etc., to Palestine. They were being stopped by the British en route, but some of them would manage to go through. These were all funded by the Jewish National Fund. So they had their own fund as well. With regards to the Palestinians, obviously they weren't funded by the British at the time, so they weren't given weapons, etc. And the other countries, they weren't really funding them with weapons as such until this time. They were keeping their own armies, strengthening their own armies, building their own forces. They were not funding or arming the Palestinians or the Arabs in Palestine. So they basically didn't have any external support or any support from anywhere else. They were weak locally, they were poor, and the situation was just making their situation from bad to worse. Not that they were any less or any more poorer, than the rest of the Arab states. The situation was approximately the same. The situation of all of these Arab states was approximately the same. The literacy rate was low. The poverty line was not as bad as it is now, but a lot of them were living in poverty, etc. And in fact, at this point in 1947, majority of the income of the area of Palestine, a lot of it, or you could say more than 50%, was coming from land which had been purchased by the Jews from the Jewish National Fund, and that was the main driving force of the economy of the land of Palestine. So the income of the Jews was even greater than in Palestine, was greater than the income of the Arabs, and that was boosting the economy. So the Arabs weren't the richest, but the Jewish income. Some of the proposals that were made, as we said, there were loads of proposals. One of the proposals that was made at once was that the Jewish state is established, the Arab state is established, and the Jewish state has to pay 50% of its profits as tax to the Arab state, and it has to take on 50% of the debt of the Arab state. This was one of the proposals that had been made at the time as well. Economically, the Arabs and the Palestinians, they weren't very strong. The Jewish groups were much stronger.
So how was the JNF as rich as it was then? Were they just rich like benefactors?
Yeah, the rich benefactors, as we mentioned, the Rothschilds and international groups around the world, UK, America-based businessmen who were all funding, and it was an international group that was set up, not just local in Palestine. So they had a system in place and a plan of putting in money, purchasing land, cultivating the land, etc. So it was all sponsored by international. Any other questions? No? Okay. Jazakallahu khairan. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal enables us to understand what is all of these events that took place, and we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal, although there's a pause for a few days, but this is not the end. After a few days, the bombing continues, the killing continues, the oppression continues. Our dua to Allah Azza wa Jal is that Allah Azza wa Jal grants complete liberation, complete freedom, complete peace and tranquility to our brothers and sisters in and around Al-Quds and Bayt al-Maqdis and all of these blessed lands of Asham, and that Allah Azza wa Jal brings them back their honor. Ameen wa akhiru da'wan alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.